The morning Silas Drum closed the mill door on Wren Calloway. The sky above Dunmore Flats had already gone the color of a bruise that hadn't finished forming. She had been inside the storage room when she heard the bolt slide. Not the wind, not the settling of old timber, the deliberate mechanical click of a man making a decision he had rehearsed. She stood still for a moment, with her broom in her hands, listening to the silence on the other side of the wood, then set the broom against the wall and walked out through the side passage into the cold. Silas was waiting in the yard with Reverend Elmore Hatch standing half a step behind him, which was where Hatch always stood when Silas was doing something that required a witness willing to call it necessary. The Reverend's coat was buttoned to the throat. His hands were folded. He had the expression of a man prepared to describe whatever happened next as the working of Providence. Silas spoke without looking directly at her. The settlement couldn't carry extra mouths through a winter like this one shaping up to be. It wasn't personal. These were the words he used, not personal, as though the cold pressing down from the Greyhorn ridgeline was capable of distinguishing between the personal and the practical. Wren did not respond immediately. She looked past Silas to the street where the windows of Dunmore Flats held the pale shapes of people who had decided that glass was sufficient distance between themselves and what was happening in the mill yard. Della Pruitt's curtain shifted and went still. The shadow behind the tack shop window leaned back into darkness. 14 months she had swept Silas Drum's floors, repaired his grain sacks, counted his inventory in the cold before the lamps were lit. Not one of those windows opened. Silas set the parting provisions on the ground between them with the careful placement of a man who wants the gesture remembered as generous. A sack of flour, a handful of dried potato slices wrapped in burlap, a spade with a cracked handle, the split wrapped in wire that had already begun to rust. Wren crouched and lifted the flour sack by its middle. The weight shifted wrong, not the uniform density of dry milled flour, but the heavier, uneven mass of grain that had already begun to clump. She pressed her thumb against the side of the sack and felt a slight give of moisture working inward from the seam. She had told him about the roof. 3 months prior, on a morning when the first real cold had come down off the pass, she had stood in the east storage room and shown him exactly where the condensation was collecting on the underside of the rafters, exactly where the moisture was tracking down the interior wall and reaching the lowest tier of grain sacks. She had used the word damage. She had used the word soon. Silas had looked at the wall, nodded in the way that means the information has been received but will not be acted upon, and changed the subject to the inventory count. She set the flour sack back down without speaking, picked up the spade, picked up the potatoes, turned toward the north end of the yard where Blythe stood beside Pepper in the gray morning light. Her daughter was 9 years old and had her father's coloring. Dark hair, brown eyes, a stillness that people sometimes mistook for shyness, but was in fact the habit of someone who had learned early that careful observation yields more reliable information than speech. Blythe was holding something with both hands cupped against her sternum, the way you hold a thing you're afraid of dropping. The ceramic jar was no larger than a coffee tin, sealed at the top with a circle of waxed cloth tied down with cord. Wren had not told Blythe to take it from the shelf before they left the mill's back room. Blythe had taken it on her own, which said everything about what the child understood of what they were leaving behind. Garrett Calloway had kept that starter alive for 11 years. He had carried it in his survey kit through 3 Wyoming winters, fed it on whatever flour was available, maintained it through the months when they had barely enough to eat themselves because he said, and he was right in the way that quiet men are sometimes comprehensively right about small important things, that the difference between having bread and not having bread was the difference between managing and failing. He called it Old Garrison. He had never explained why. After he died in February of 1881, with the ground still too frozen to bury him properly, Wren had continued feeding the starter because stopping felt like a second death she wasn't prepared to authorize. Hatch said something about providence in the Lord's provision. Wren did not turn around. She had known since the previous evening when she felt the barometric change in the quality of the air above the pass that the storm coming was not an ordinary one. The sky had a density to it that ordinary storms didn't carry a compression, as though the atmosphere above Greyhorn was consolidating itself for something deliberate. She had 2 hours, perhaps 3, before the full weight of it came down into the valley. The road north out of Dunmore Flats climbed toward the pass for 6 miles before it leveled, and the pass itself sat at 7,200 feet exposed on 3 sides to whatever the mountain wanted to send down. She had packed the night before, not because she had known Silas would move in the morning, but because she had understood for several weeks that the morning was coming. The pack on Pepper's back contained their 2 blankets, the small cook pot, the remainder of their serviceable clothing, the length of rope she had accumulated piece by piece over 14 months, the tin of matches wrapped in oilcloth, the 6 feet of 18-gauge iron wire she had found on the mill floor and pocketed without conscious intention. At the bottom of the pack, wrapped separately in a piece of canvas, and then in Garrett's survey coat, was his field notebook. The leather cover had softened with handling over 2 years of her carrying it without opening it, or rather opening it rarely, only when she needed to feel the specific texture of his handwriting under her fingertips. She had opened it 3 days ago looking for something she couldn't have named and found instead what she needed. The entry was dated April 1879, written in the careful compressed script Garrett used when he was recording something he considered professionally significant. He had been surveying a prospective spurline route through the eastern approach to the Greyhorn Range for the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad, a job that required him to spend 6 weeks moving through terrain that the railroad would ultimately decide was not worth the engineering cost. The entry described a canyon feature he had encountered while mapping the drainage patterns above Sulphur Creek, a lateral cut in the limestone that ran roughly northeast for perhaps a quarter mile before widening into what he estimated as a moderate-sized chamber. He noted the temperature differential between the canyon floor and the surrounding terrain. He noted that the ground at the chamber's interior did not exhibit the frost penetration evident in the surrounding geology. He wrote, in the measured language of a man trained to record without editorializing possible hydrothermal influence, no rail value, worth knowing. 3 words at the end, worth knowing. She had read that entry perhaps 20 times in the past 3 days, each time returning to those 3 words and measuring them against what she knew about the terrain between Dunmore Flats and the Upper Pass. The canyon Garrett described would be accessible from the North Road approximately 2 miles before the pass summit on the eastern side of the drainage. She had never been there. She had no way to verify that the thermal anomaly he'd recorded in April held through December. She had nothing except the observation of a careful man who had spent his working life learning to read what the ground was saying. She had Blythe. She had Pepper. She had Cutter, the big yellow cur, who had attached himself to Blythe 8 months ago and had since demonstrated a loyalty that bordered on the structural. He was simply part of the load-bearing arrangement of their household, not negotiable. She had the spade, the flour, the potatoes, old Garrison, the wire, the rope, the cook pot, the matches, 2 blankets, the field notebook. She started walking. The first mile out of Dunmore Flats was the worst mile because it was the mile where looking back was still possible. She did not look back. Cutter ranged ahead on the road, disappearing into the gray curtain of wind-driven snow and returning at intervals, checking her position with the methodical reliability of a working dog who takes his responsibilities seriously. Pepper walked steadily, the pack shifting with her gait, her breath making small explosions in the cold air. Blythe walked beside the mule with one hand on the pack frame, not for support, but for contact, the child's way of maintaining orientation in conditions where everything looked the same. Jonas Whitfield was standing in front of his shop at the edge of town when they passed. He was the only person who had come outside. He held his hat in his hands in front of him, the unconscious gesture of a man confronting something he doesn't know the protocol for, and watched them move past without speaking. Wren did not stop. She did not need anything from Jonas Whitfield in that moment. But she noted in the part of her mind that recorded things without being asked, that he stayed standing in the road after they had passed, watching them go, and she could feel his watching on the back of her neck for longer than the distance should have allowed. The storm came down off the pass in the 2nd mile with a seriousness she had correctly anticipated. The wind shifted from the northwest to the north in the space of about 30 seconds, dropping the temperature by what felt like 15 degrees in a single gust. Then the snowfall that had been polite and directional became something 3-dimensional, coming from above, from the side, kicking up from the road surface in spirals. Blythe pulled her scarf up over her nose. Pepper dropped her head and leaned into it. Cutter appeared out of the white check, their position, disappeared again. The road to the pass was not much of a road. It had been used enough in the summer months to establish a track, but the track had never been graded or maintained in any formal sense, and in winter it became a suggestion rather than a direction, a general orientation toward higher ground through terrain that all looked equally hostile. Wren navigated by the drainage keep, the main creek sound on the left stay on the high ground above the floodplain bear, right where the valley narrowed. Garrett had taught her to read terrain by its water logic. Where water went in spring, you did not want to be in winter. The high ground was colder but more reliable. At roughly 2 miles from the summit, Blythe went through the ice. The shelf was hidden under 8 inches of undisturbed snow, a section of the road where a small tributary had overflowed in the previous week's partial thaw, spread thin across the path surface, refrozen in the subsequent cold. The ice was thick enough to hold a mule, but thin enough at the edges to fail under a child's weight in a particular distribution. Blythe's right foot went through first, then her left. Then she was sitting in 8 inches of icy water with the shelf cracking in a radius around her. Wren had her out in under 30 seconds, but the damage was done. Blythe's boots had taken on water. In current conditions, wet feet at altitude were a timeline, not a discomfort. Wren stripped the child's boots, immediately dried her feet with the inside of her own coat, wrapped both feet in the extra wool stockings from the pack, pulled the boots back on, and packed the gaps at the ankle with dry sage she broke from a nearby stem. Not a solution, an extension. She had perhaps 2 hours before the wet wicked threw. Cutter was not on the road. She realized this when she looked up from Blythe's feet, and he was simply absent, not at the edge of her vision, not returning from one of his ranging loops. She waited 15 seconds, scanning the snow in every direction. Then she saw him 30 yards up the eastern drainage, moving along the base of the limestone wall that formed the canyon's near side, his nose working in tight patterns against the stone. Not hunting. Reading. She had learned to pay attention to what Cutter paid attention to. She left the road and followed him, leading Pepper, one hand on Blythe's shoulder. The limestone wall curved as she approached it, the canyon angling northeast in exactly the configuration Garrett had described. The snow cover on the wall face was uneven in a specific way, thinner in patches, the stone visible through the white. At irregular intervals, the melt patterns wrong for simple wind exposure. The discrepancy was subtle. You would not have noticed it without a reason to look. She pulled off her right glove, reached out, pressed her palm flat against the exposed stone at the thinnest patch of snow cover. Warmth. Not dramatic, not the warmth of something burning or recently worked. The persistent, deep warmth of something that had been holding temperature for a very long time. Geological time, the kind of warmth that doesn't respond to seasons because it comes from somewhere below the reach of seasons. She looked at the base of the wall where it met the canyon floor. A crack ran along the junction, 4 inches wide, its interior dark. She knelt and held her ungloved hand near the crack without touching it. A current of air moved against her palm, not cold, not warm, but temperate, the specific temperature of something that maintains itself regardless of what the sky is doing. She broke a dry twig from the sagebrush beside her, held it near the crack. Let it go. It dropped slightly, caught the current, drifted inward toward the canyon wall. The earth was breathing. The breath was going inward. She stood, put her glove back on, looked up the wall to where the canyon narrowed into a visible passage between two limestone faces. She looked at Blythe, whose feet were still dry in their improvised insulation, who was watching her mother with the careful attention she brought to everything Wren did when Wren was figuring something out. "Come on," Wren said, and there was nothing else in those 2 words except the next thing, which was enough. The passage between the limestone walls was narrower than it looked from the outside shoulder width, for a woman, tight for a mule, requiring Pepper to turn her head sideways and trust the pull of the lead rope through the worst of it. It ran for perhaps 40 yards before opening into a chamber that was substantially larger than the crack had suggested was possible. The ceiling rose to twice Wren's height. The floor was uneven but mostly flat. The far wall curved inward, creating a natural alcove that faced away from the prevailing wind direction. The snow inside the passage thinned immediately. By the time they reached the chamber, the floor showed bare stone in patches, the frost line shallow enough that she could scratch through it with the tip of the spade to reach unfrozen earth beneath. The temperature difference from outside was not dramatic. She estimated perhaps 12 degrees, but 12 degrees was the distance between water freezing and water staying liquid, between ground that would accept a post and ground that would reject one, between a fire that would draw and a fire that would fail. She broke dead branches from a scrub juniper growing improbably from a crack in the lower wall and arranged them in a small stack near the alcove's back corner. The match she lit went out once in the draft from the passage, then held on the second try, catching the dry bark in the patient, credible way that fire catches when the conditions are sufficient. She watched the smoke. It rose vertically for 6 inches, then curved not back toward them, but toward the interior of the alcove. Tracking a current she hadn't fully identified yet, an air movement pulling from the passage entrance towards some deeper exhaust point in the rock. The smoke bent, followed its direction, disappeared. She had thought riding the edge of the panic that she refused to let fully form since the moment the mill door bolted, that she was looking for a place to survive the night. What she was looking at now was something with more potential than that, and she understood it would cost her everything she had to realize even half of it, and she began to inventory what she had. Blythe sat down on the stone floor and unlaced her boots. She checked her own feet with a methodical thoroughness that Wren recognized as her own habit returned to her. The feet were cold but not wet, the improvised packing had held. She looked up at her mother with an expression that did not ask any of the questions it could have asked. Wren had known a woman in Ohio in the years before the West whose husband had died in a mill accident and left her with a farm she did not know how to run. The woman had sold the farm inside a month, moved to her sister's household, spent the next decade in a species of managed dependency that left her fundamentally diminished by the time she died. Wren had watched this happen from a distance close enough to understand it was a choice, not an inevitability, not a judgment. A thing to know about how grief handled one way became a different kind of loss. She thought about this woman for exactly the time it took to set the cookpot in the fire's edge with a packed handful of snow in the bottom. Then she stopped thinking about her. "I need you to start collecting rocks," she told Blythe. "Flat ones if you can find them, bigger than your palm. Stack them against the back wall." Blythe put her boots back on and went to work. Wren drove the first post before the light failed. The ground in the alcove's interior took the stake with the resistance of earth that has structure and memory. Not frozen concrete, not loose sand, but something with grip. She drove the second post 2 feet from the first. She started lashing the crossmember before she could think too carefully about what she was building. Because she had learned in the 2 years since Garrett died that thinking too carefully about what you were building was how you avoided starting it. The wind outside found the canyon mouth sometime after dark and ran along the limestone walls with a sound like water moving fast through a narrow place. Inside, the fire held. Pepper stood in the lee of the half-built windbreak with her eyes partly closed, generating warmth through the particular steadiness of an animal that has found shelter adequate to its needs. Cutter lay near Blythe with his chin on his paws, tracking Wren's movement through the chamber with the slow rotation of his eyes. Blythe slept. Wren did not. She sat near the fire and opened Garrett's field notebook to the April 1879 entry and read it again in the firelight. This time reading not for information but for the voice behind the information. The careful, unhurried voice of a man who had found something interesting in the earth and recorded it faithfully without knowing in 1879 who would need it in 1882. Worth knowing. He had written those 2 words without any consciousness of writing them for her. He had written them because he was the kind of man who believed that accurate observation was worth preserving independent of any immediate application. She closed the notebook, held it in both hands for a moment. Outside Dunmore Flats was a collection of lit windows in a valley she could no longer see. Whatever was happening in those windows was no longer her immediate problem. Her immediate problem was the windbreak, which was half finished, the post spacing of which she had already identified as slightly too wide on the south end, where the canyon's particular air movement would create a pressure point. She would fix that in the morning. She would fix the post spacing, then start on the sleeping platform, then think about the food situation, then think about water, then think about heat retention over a multi-week period rather than a single night. One problem at a time in the order that problems needed solving. The fire settled into its coals with the small sounds of wood completing its conversion to heat. Wren watched it for a while, measuring the warmth against her face, learning the particular character of this place, how it held temperature, where the drafts moved, what the stone was willing to offer. Every place had a logic to it. Every landscape had things it was willing to do and things it would refuse. The work was always in learning to ask the right questions. She had asked the ground tonight. It had answered. The cold that settled into Sulphur Cut after the first week was a different kind of cold than anything Wren had known on the open plain. It had weight to it. It pressed down through the limestone ceiling and rose up through the stone floor, and it moved the way water moves, finding every crack, every gap, every place where warmth tried to hold its ground. She had learned to respect it the way you respect a river in flood, not by fighting it, but by understanding where it wanted to go. The shelter had taken shape through those first days in the way that necessary things take shape Not according to plan, but according to problem. The windbreak on the exposed side of the niche had gone up first stone stacked against stone, with Pepper dragging the heavier pieces from the canyon floor, while Wren rolled the largest by hand shoulders burning long after the light failed. The sleeping platform came next, posts sunk into the earth. Cross members lashed with rope she'd unraveled from 3 different sources. A surface of salvaged branches covered with sagebrush, packed tight enough to keep the cold from rising through. It creaked when Blythe climbed onto it. It held. The food storage came third, a hanging frame of forked branches and cord, high enough that nothing with 4 legs could reach it by standing low enough that Wren could reach it without a stool. She had thought about what rotted and why. Moisture rose. Warmth concentrated near the fire. The hanging position kept the supplies in the coolest moving air while staying dry. None of it looked like anything. The walls were uneven. The platform tilted slightly east. The hanging frame leaned. But each piece solved something winter would have used against them, and that was the only measure that mattered. She had known from the second morning that staying alive through one storm was not the same as surviving a winter. The biscuits she'd rationed from Blythe's pack would last another 10 days if she stretched them. The flour and Silas Drum's parting sack, the damp, poorly milled flour she'd felt shift in her hands when she picked it up, had turned out to be worse than she'd estimated. The surface was salvageable. The interior had clumped into hard masses that crumbled when she broke them apart, releasing a smell that was not quite sour, not quite rot, but somewhere between. She spread it on cloth near the warmest section of rock, sifting it twice a day, picking out the worst pieces. Maybe half of it would bake. Maybe. The hydrothermal vent beneath the canyon floor, the thing Garrett had noted in his field book, with that careful, non-committal hand, was real, and it was enough. Not dramatic. Not the kind of thing that would have impressed anyone standing in it for the first time. The ground didn't steam. Nothing glowed. What it did was refuse to freeze, and in December in Wyoming territory, that refusal was the difference between a grave and a garden. She found the secondary chamber on the 3rd morning following a passage that narrowed to shoulder width before opening again into something the size of a large root cellar. The ceiling cracked along a diagonal fault line, and through the widest point of the crack, a finger of winter light fell to the floor for approximately 4 hours each day, moving from the northwest corner toward the center as the sun tracked low across the southern sky. She stood in that light for a long time, watching it move across the stone. Garrett's seed pouch was in the bottom of her pack, wrapped in oilcloth tied with a cord she had not loosened since the day she packed it. She had brought it the way you bring a thing you cannot explain bringing, not because she had a plan for it, but because leaving it behind had felt like leaving him behind a second time. The seeds inside were from the USDA distribution program in Cheyenne, purchased the spring before Garrett died, never planted because he got sick before the ground softened. Scotch kale, Detroit dark red beets, rosin rye, a small envelope of turnips labeled in someone else's handwriting, the ink faded to a near illegible brown. She looked at the crack of light. She looked at the pouch in her hands. She looked at the floor. The floor needed work. Wren spent 2 days moving soil. She carried it in a folded piece of canvas, hauling load after load from the moisture sections of the canyon floor, where the frost line stayed shallow. Mixing it with the pale limestone grit that made up the chamber's existing surface, adding a layer of ash from the cook fire, and a measure of dried leaf matter she'd found packed under a rock overhang, compressed by summer rains already beginning to break down. The result was not good soil, but it was not bad soil either. It was a start. She planted the kale, first pressing the seeds in at the depth Garrett had told her one winter evening, while she sat mending his survey coat twice the diameter of the seed, no deeper, no shallower. She planted the beets in the strip nearest the light. The rye went along the back wall where the temperature held steadiest. The turnips she held back, watching. For 3 days the plot looked promising. The kale rows held their shape. The soil stayed loose. The light came through on schedule, swept the floor, withdrew. Wren checked the ground each morning before she lit the cook fire, pressing 2 fingers into the earth the way Garrett had shown her, not to feel the temperature, but to feel the moisture level, to feel whether the top inch was working or dying. On the 4th morning, the kale seedlings had collapsed. She crouched over the row for a long time, not moving. The tiny stems had gone soft at the base, folding over in a way that meant the roots were still alive but losing the fight. She touched one carefully. The stem left a faint wet mark on her fingertip. Too much moisture, but she hadn't watered them. The chamber had stayed dry enough, she'd checked. She looked up at the limestone wall directly behind the kale row. In the early morning cold, before the vent beneath the floor had fully warmed the chamber, the wall was sweating. A faint sheen of condensation had formed along a 2-foot section of stone, where the thermal gradient was steepest, where the warmth rising from the fractured bedrock met the cold surface of the upper wall. The moisture beaded ran in hairline tracks and fell. Not much. Enough. The heat had made her careless. She had measured temperature when she should have measured moisture. She had looked at the floor and not at the wall. The problem had been there since the first morning, working quietly while she worked at something else. She pulled the seedlings, laid them beside the row, sat back on her heels. Blythe appeared in the passage doorway holding the lantern. She looked at the pulled seedlings, then at her mother's face. She did not say anything. She had learned in the weeks since Dunmore Flats when speech helped and when it did not. Wren did not sleep that night. She moved through the chamber with the lantern watching. She placed small stones at every point where she saw or suspected moisture, at the base of the walls, along the crack in the ceiling, at the junction where the floor met the stone. By the time Blythe woke in the morning, the chamber floor was marked with a constellation of small stones, each one a data point, a recorded observation, a problem given a name. She spent the following 2 days solving them one at a time. The condensation wall got a willow branch lattice cut from the creek drainage at the lower end of the canyon, where a thin stand of sandbar willow had survived under a rock shelf. She drove the uprights into the floor, wove the horizontals through left, a 4-inch gap between the lattice and the stone. Air could now move through that gap, rather than pooling against the rock face. Moisture would still form on the wall. It would no longer drip directly onto the soil. A shallow drainage channel 2 inches wide, 1 inch deep, carved with a broken-handled spade along the perimeter of the growing area, collected what ran from the walls and directed it toward a low point near the passage entrance, away from the roots. The rye row got moved 6 inches toward the center of the chamber, away from the section of ceiling where the crack wept on cold mornings. She replanted. The second planting went in with a modification, a 1/2-inch bed of coarse grit. Limestone chips she'd knocked from a loose section of the upper wall worked into the top layer of soil around each seed to improve drainage at the surface. She tilted the beet row slightly, just enough to encourage runoff away from the root zone. The rye she planted deeper than the first time, relying on the consistent warmth of the lower soil to compensate for the shallower light. On day 9 of the second planting, the kale did not collapse. On day 12, the beet seedlings appeared pale, yellow-green threads barely visible against the dark soil thinner than a bootlace, each one improbably alive. It was not a garden. It would not be a garden for weeks yet. But it was something growing where nothing should have been able to grow, and Wren permitted herself exactly the amount of satisfaction that the situation warranted. She pressed her lips together, nodded once at the beet row, then went back to the main chamber to tend the second oven. The first oven she had built by instinct, the way you build things when urgency overrides knowledge. She had mortared clay around a low ring of stone-packed ash beneath the firebox for insulation, fed the fire slowly until the chamber felt hot. The loaf she pulled out on day 4 had a black crust and an uncooked center, dense, wet, inedible in any quantity. She had eaten the outer crust herself, given Blythe the least damaged section, thrown the rest to Cutter. 3 days of carefully rationed flour gone. The second oven took her 2 days to build and used everything she had learned from the first failure. The walls went up thicker, 4 inches of clay and grit composite, instead of 2 each layer pressed while wet, allowed to dry partially before the next went on. She set sandstone blocks behind the firebox chosen for their density, positioned to absorb heat during the burn, and release it slowly after the fire died. The mouth she made narrower, a deliberate constriction to trap the thermal mass inside the chamber rather than letting it escape with the smoke. She cured the whole structure with 3 successive small fires over 2 days, letting the clay set fully before she trusted it with anything that mattered. On day 12, she let a proper fire burn for 3 hours, then raked the coals out entirely. Waited. The oven interior was too hot to hold her hand near for the first hour, warm enough to bake for the second. She set the dough 1/3 of the remaining flour, Old Garrison, that had been running strong for the past 4 days, and sealed the mouth with a flat stone. Then she waited again. She had never been good at waiting. Garrett used to say that patience was not her virtue and precision was not his, and between the two of them, they made one competent person. She had laughed at that. She did not laugh now, but she thought about it while she sat beside the sealed oven in the dark, listening to Blythe breathe on the sleeping platform and Cutter shift his weight near the entrance. The loaf came out at dawn of day 13. Its shape was imperfect. One side had risen higher than the other, pressing against the oven wall during baking, leaving a flat scar along the crust. The surface had cracked in two places. The color was uneven darker where the sandstone radiated highest. She tapped the bottom with one knuckle. The knock was hollow, dry, solid. The steam that escaped through the larger crack carried the smell of something actually cooked yeast and crust, and the faint mineral note of the limestone water she'd used to proof the starter. Blythe woke before Wren had fully turned around. She climbed down from the platform without speaking, crossed the chamber, stood beside her mother. Cutter raised his head and held it there, ears forward, watching. Wren cut the loaf on a flat stone. The interior was even, firm crumb, consistent color, all the way through, no wet center, no raw streak. She handed Blythe the larger piece. Blythe cupped it in both palms, closed her eyes for a moment. Then she ate. That was enough. The warmth that came with the bread, caloric, physical, real, made the cold feel for the first time like something negotiable rather than something absolute. But warmth from bread alone runs out. Wren had known since the first week that protein was the problem she'd been avoiding thinking about directly. The flour could sustain them at a maintenance level. The winter vegetables, when they came in, would add micronutrients. Her body was already beginning to ask for, in ways she recognized, the craving for anything fatty. The fatigue that hit her at midday, despite adequate sleep, the small wounds on her hands that healed more slowly than they should. These were the signs of a body running on insufficient input. She knew them because she'd seen them in others. Seeing them in herself required a different kind of attention. The wire was in her coat pocket. She'd picked it up from Silas Drum's floor on her last morning in the mill. Not deliberately, her hands had found it while she was gathering her few things, the automatic scavenging reflex of someone who had grown up on a farm where nothing useful was wasted. A 6-foot length of 18-gauge iron wire, salvaged from a broken fence repair, coiled twice around her fingers and dropped into her pocket. She had not thought about it again until day 15, when she noticed Cutter's sudden, intense interest in a section of sagebrush at the lower end of the canyon. The dog moved differently near that scrub line, low, deliberate nose working in the way he worked when the scent was fresh and specific. Snowshoe hair. She'd seen the tracks, the asymmetric double stamp of the large rear feet, the smaller front impressions, running patterns that suggested regular routes along the same passages through the brush. Prey creates habit. Habit creates opportunity. She fashioned the snares from memory. The wire twisted into a loop, the right diameter for a hare's head. The standing end anchored to a brush stem at nose height. Set them along 3 separate runs she identified by track pattern, staggered so that a single cautious animal would not encounter more than one in a given passage. Left them for 48 hours without checking, which was the hardest part, the discipline of not disturbing the site before the hare's anxiety had settled. The first check yielded nothing. The second, on the morning of day 19, yielded 1. She processed it quickly without sentiment, the way her father had taught her the way of people for whom meat is labor, not sport. The bones went into a pot of snowmelt water over the fire, simmering for 3 hours until the broth ran gold. The fat she rendered separately and stored in a salvage tin, using small amounts to waterproof the worst cracked sections of her boot seams. The pelt she stretched on a frame of bent willow scraped with the back of her knife, hung to dry near the oven exhaust where the warm air would cure it without cooking it. The broth poured over torn bread in a stone bowl was the best thing either of them had eaten in 3 weeks. Blythe finished hers and did not look up from the bowl for a long moment afterward. That was day 19. Day 31 came the way bad weather always came in the high terrain, without announcement, with full intent. The front moved in from the north while Wren was working the garden chamber, and she knew it before she heard it, the way, a change in air pressure, as a change in sound, a dampening of everything that had been moving, and a sudden held breath quality to the canyon. Cutter was at the entrance when she came back into the main chamber, standing with his hackles raised and his tail tucked facing outward. The wind hit within the hour. This was not the wind that had brought them to Sulphur Cut. That had been a seasonal storm, brutal but moving in one direction, following the established path through the pass. This front was different. It came off the Greyhorn ridgeline and fell into the canyon from above, rather than sweeping through the mouth. A katabatic drop that gathered speed down the granite face and arrived at the niche entrance as a concentrated fist of air moving at an angle the windbreak had not been designed to address. The windbreak held for 4 hours. Then a section of the upper course shifted the dry stacked stones, torquing against each other under lateral pressure, and a 2-foot section came down in a single cascading fall. The gap it left channeled the wind directly into the niche, not the full force but enough. The cook fire guttered, flattened, nearly went out. Smoke that had been rising cleanly began to roll back across the sleeping platform. Blythe coughed, pulled her blanket over her face. Wren worked through the night. She rebuilt the fallen section, first resetting the stones with better horizontal locking, using clay mud from a wet section of the canyon floor to mortar the most critical joints. While the mud set, she turned her attention to the smoke problem, which was not what she had initially assumed. She had believed the smoke reversal was caused by the gap in the windbreak by the wind pressure entering the chamber. She spent an hour on that theory before she noticed that the smoke behavior was wrong for a pressure problem. Pressure reversals push smoke back uniformly. This was doing something different, accumulating near the sleeping platform while clearing near the floor, pooling at a specific height, finding a specific path. She traced it to the windbreak itself. The rebuilt and reinforced structure was now so effective at blocking the canyon entrance that it had disrupted the natural air movement through the niche. Before the repairs, the cave had drawn air across itself in a diagonal pattern. She had confirmed this with the smoke test on the first night, creating a draft that moved combustion gases toward the chamber's natural exhaust points. The new windbreak blocked the low-level intake that drove that draft. Without the through flow, the smoke had nowhere to go. The solution required taking apart part of what she had just built. She opened a gap near the base of the windbreak, deliberately, strategically, not a structural failure, but a designed aperture, a slot 4 inches high at the point where the prevailing air would enter at the lowest pressure angle. Enough to restore the draft, not enough to bring the storm inside. The next smoke column rose straight for 8 inches, then Bent found the diagonal move toward the back of the chamber, disappeared. She sat on the ground in front of the fire. The sky beyond the windbreak was beginning to gray at its lowest edge. Blythe slept. Cutter had come back from the entrance and lay with his head on his paws, watching her with the patient, unsentimental attention that dogs give to the humans they've decided to monitor. There were things she could not fix by working harder. She had understood this since Garrett died, since the moment the doctor and Cheyenne had used the word irreversible, and she had realized that her entire catalog of practical responses had no entry for this situation. You cannot solve a fever with better tools. You cannot rebuild what is already gone. But most things that broke could be studied until they revealed their logic. Most failures contain their own explanation if you were willing to look at them long enough without flinching. The windbreak had failed because of how she had succeeded. The kale had died because the warmth she'd counted on as an asset had brought a liability she hadn't measured. The lesson kept repeating itself in different forms, and she was beginning to understand it not as a series of individual lessons, but as a single continuous truth. Every solution carries the seed of its next problem. The work is never finished. It only changes shape. The fever came on day 34. She noticed it first in Blythe's eyes, a brightness that was not alertness, a shine that belonged to inflammation rather than health. By midday, the child was burning. By nightfall, she was shaking under 2 blankets, her breath coming in the shallow, effortful rhythm that meant the body was working harder than it should have to be working just to stay in motion. Wren built the fire as high as she dared and set a pot of snowmelt to boil. She had the bone broth from the last hare, 2 cups left stored in the tin near the warm wall. She heated it, slowly skimmed the fat that rose, added a small amount of the ash and limestone mineral water she had identified as the cleanest source in the canyon. Not medicine. Calories and heat in a form a sick body could accept. Blythe drank without lifting her head from the blanket. Then she slept. Wren sat beside her and did not sleep. At some point in the second night, she made the calculation she had been avoiding. The flour reserve that remained enough for perhaps 4 more loaves if she stretched it included the portion she had set aside to maintain Old Garrison's feeding schedule. The starter needed flour every 2 days to stay viable at the current temperatures. Without it, the culture would weaken, then go dormant, then die if the dormancy lasted too long. It had taken Garrett 11 years to build Old Garrison's character, its resilience across different flour types and conditions. She could not rebuild that. She looked at Old Garrison's jar on the warm ledge. She looked at Blythe. She made the porridge. She used a full cup of the precious flour, cooked it long and slow in the mineral water until it thickened enough to stay down. She let it cool to barely warm and woke Blythe enough to eat. Old Garrison went without its scheduled feeding. The third day of the fever was the worst. Blythe woke twice, unaware of where she was speaking to someone who was not in the chamber. Wren answered her as if the conversation made sense, keeping her voice level, keeping the fire burning, keeping the water warm and ready. She checked Blythe's hands every hour. She had seen what unchecked fever did to extremities. She was not going to see it happen here. On the morning of the fourth day, the breathing changed. Slower, deeper. The body no longer fighting at the surface, settling, conserving, which was what recovery looked like in its early hours. By afternoon, Blythe's eyes focused correctly. She asked for water, drank it, looked around the chamber with the recalibrating attention of someone who has been somewhere else for several days. Wren was sitting on the ground 3 feet away, her back against the warm wall, her hands in her lap. She had not slept in 72 hours. When Blythe reached out and touched her sleeve, Wren put her hand over her daughter's and held it there for a moment longer than was necessary, which was the only thing she allowed herself. Old Garrison had gone quiet. The surface was flat and pale, the smell faintly suspended, not spoiled but waiting. She moved the jar to the warmest section of the back wall, the limestone mass she had identified early as the most thermally stable point in the chamber, where the differential between morning cold and midday warmth was smallest. She wrapped it in Garrett's survey coat, the one with the company's worn patch on the left breast, the one that carried the particular combination of cold air and graphite that she had stopped trying to think about directly. She tucked the jar inside with the same care you give anything that cannot be replaced. On the second morning after, a single cluster of small bubbles appeared at the edge of the starter's surface. On the morning after that, the mass had risen a quarter inch. The smell had come back clean, sharp, alive. She stood at the ledge for a while looking at it. Then she turned back to the work. The snares kept providing. Blythe recovered enough to move carefully through the canyon, began checking the lower snare line herself each morning. The child moved through the snow with an economy of motion that was not something Wren had taught her directly. It was something absorbed through weeks of watching, through the specific gravity of a situation that does not allow for inefficiency. By day 42, the kale was producing true leaves. Not harvestable yet, but visibly, unmistakably alive in the slanted winter light. The beets were following slower root development, impossible to see, but leaf growth steady. The rye had sent up thin, determined shoots along the back wall. Green in January in Wyoming. Blythe stood beside her in the chamber doorway on the morning the kale had turned from pale yellow-green to the deeper color that meant the chlorophyll was working. The child reached out and touched one leaf with one finger, not pulling it, not harvesting it, just confirming it was real. Wren watched her do it and said nothing because nothing needed to be said. Wren heard the approach on day 46 before Cutter registered it. A sound more complex than a single traveler, though she would soon realize it was only one man, Jonas Whitfield, whose deliberate footfalls in snow had a distinct pattern she hadn't known she'd memorized. He came straight up the canyon without the lateral searching of someone uncertain of their destination. The smell reached him before the sight did. She heard him stop. She heard the specific silence of a person standing still in cold air, trying to make sense of what they were smelling. Bread. Fresh bread in January in a limestone canyon above Greyhorn Pass, where nothing was supposed to be alive. She stayed where she was. Let him come the rest of the way on his own terms. Jonas Whitfield stepped around the entrance stone and into the niche and stopped a second time because now he could see it. The oven, the hanging storage, the sleeping platform, Pepper standing placidly in her shelter of stone and timber. Blythe emerging from the garden passage carrying a small bundle of outer kale leaves. The first true harvest, thin leaves but real ones. The man's face went through several expressions. Wren recognized all of them. She had felt most of them herself over the past 6 weeks, usually alone in the dark. He pulled off his hat, held it with both hands in front of him. "People think you're dead," he said, which was not an apology, but was as close to one as the situation and the man allowed. Wren looked at him evenly. "What people think doesn't change what's true." She gestured toward the flat stone near the fire where half a loaf sat cooling. He sat. She poured broth. He drank it with the focus of a man tasting something he had not expected to taste again before spring. The second visit came 4 days later. Jonas brought information the way he carried everything, directly without ornament. The east storage room of Silas Drum's mill had failed. Not dramatically, a sustained seep through the compromised sheathing over 10 days of alternating freeze and partial thaw had penetrated the stored flour at the contact points, and the damage had spread inward the way damage always spreads when no one is watching for it. More than half the winter reserve was unusable. The community bake oven had developed a crack in the flue that sent smoke back into the work area whenever the wind came from the southwest. The families were managing his word, which Wren understood to mean something close to its opposite. She asked her questions in order. How many children under 10? Which households had elderly members who could not handle hard rations? Whether Della Pruitt's youngest was still nursing or had moved to solids. Jonas answered each one with the slightly startled attention of a man who had not expected the conversation to be a census. When she had what she needed, she stopped asking. The silence in the chamber had the specific gravity of a decision forming. She could sustain the two of them through the remainder of the winter with what the shelter was producing with appropriate management. She could do that, or she could do something else. The arithmetic was not complicated. The decision was not complicated either once she stopped treating it as one. The Pruitt children first, she said. Della needs the calories as much as the youngest does directly. After that, the Hatcher household, the infant's mother, needs fat and protein, or her milk will fail. Then the Wickham brothers, old enough to manage hard rations, but old enough that a sustained deficit will hit them in ways that won't show until spring. Jonas had his hat turning in his hands again. He was looking at her with the expression of someone watching something they will describe later and not be fully believed. Silas Drum, she continued. He has 3 mine workers eating out of the mill's communal stores. Whatever he has left is already spoken for. He looked at her for a moment. You want me to bring supplies to Silas Drum? I want you to bring supplies to 3 men who work in a mine and need to eat to do it safely. Silas is incidental. She began pulling the cooled loaves from the stone. Don't put a name on the sack. Jonas left with a canvas sack heavier than he had arrived with. The deliveries continued over the following weeks in the quiet, systematic way that Wren organized everything. The recipients received the bread, the bundled kale, the occasional portion of dried beet greens without a note, without a name attached. Some assumed a neighbor. Some assumed Jonas himself. None of them in those first weeks arrived at the correct conclusion. The supply run to Laramie happened on the 71st day in a window of weather that held long enough for the round trip. Jonas had identified the man with the sound horse. Wren had told Jonas what to tell him. The resupply changed the arithmetic for the remainder of the winter, not comfortable, but sustainable. Then on the 72nd day, the information about what was happening at Sulphur Cut reached Dunmore Flats the way truths reach small places sideways through accumulation. A child mentioned this bread tasted different from anything the community oven had produced. A woman noticed the kale hadn't come from any garden she recognized. Jonas, pressed directly by Florence Wick over her kitchen table, gave her the name. Florence told 2 people. By the time it reached Silas Drum, its accuracy was no longer in question, only its implications. The meeting in the church happened on what Wren calculated as the 75th day. She was not there. Jonas told her about it afterwards, standing in the passage entrance with the returning canvas sack on his back. Reverend Hatch had spoken first. He described the situation as evidence of divine mercy, the Lord providing through unexpected instruments. A tidy interpretation. It cost nothing, explained nothing, required no one to examine any behavior. Jonas had waited until Hatch finished. Then he stood up Jonas Whitfield, who delivered mail and repaired saddles, who had no particular authority in the structure of Dunmore Flats, beyond the authority of someone who had been watching accurately and said what he had seen. He described the oven and its wall dimensions. He described the drainage channel in the garden chamber, the willow lattice, the planting rows, the condition of the snare system, the sleeping platform, the windbreak modification that had taken her most of a night to understand. He described these things in the unembellished language of a man whose job requires accurate description of conditions encountered on a route. That is not mercy, he said when Hatch moved to reframe the silence. That is a woman who measured her problems and solved them one at a time. Call it what it is or don't call it anything, but don't dress it up as something that cost nobody nothing. The room had gone quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something true has been said in a context designed to prevent truth from being too direct. Silas Drum had not spoken during the meeting. A week after the meeting, a group of 7 people made the climb from Dunmore Flats to Sulphur Cut on a morning that carried the first fractional suggestion that the Cold's authority over the Greyhorn Range might eventually admit of modification not broken, not finished, but fractionally willing to consider other arrangements. Silas came. He walks near the front of the group, not at its head, the position of a man who has decided to be present without claiming leadership. Caleb Pruitt came, his right leg still bound from a mining injury, but apparently not from a climb, when the reason was sufficient. Florence Wick came with a cloth-wrapped bundle. 2 of the mine workers came. A younger man named Tate, who had masonry experience from work in Cheyenne, came out of something between curiosity and the instinct that what he was about to see was worth seeing. The Reverend did not come. They came through this canyon in a loose line. Wren watched them see the shelter. It was the garden chamber that stopped them one by one, the specific incomprehensibility of green leaves growing in winter and stone in a canyon that should, by any ordinary reckoning, have contained nothing alive. Florence Wick pressed her gloved hand over her mouth. One of the mine workers crouched near the kale row and touched the soil, then looked at his fingertip as though checking that it was real. Caleb Pruitt stood in the passage doorway for a long time, looking at the beet row, at the rye along the back wall, at the crack of winter light falling from the ceiling onto growing things. Silas Drum did not go into the garden chamber. He stayed in the main chamber and examined the oven with the methodical attention of a man who works with materials and knows how to read what he is looking at. He ran his palm along the exterior wall. He studied the firebox proportions. He was a miller, which meant he understood thermodynamics in the practical sense, how stone absorbs and releases moisture, how grain behaves under different temperature conditions. He recognized the thinking embedded in the construction even where the application was new to him. "How thick did you make the back wall?" His voice carried none of the register of the mill yard. Wren told him. 4 inches of composite sandstone blocks behind the firebox cured over 3 fires before the first baking load. "The flue in the community oven," he said. "The crack is in the upper section. We couldn't work out why the smoke reversed." She had not been inside Dunmore Flats' community oven. She thought about what Jonas had described: the crack in the upper flue, the smoke reversal on southwest winds. She thought about the windbreak at Sulphur Cut, about the night she had spent learning that a solution could create the next problem by solving two completely. "The crack disrupted the draw," she said. "If the upper section lost integrity, the column wouldn't sustain the pressure differential that pulls combustion gases upward. Southwest wind would push back against a weakened draw and reverse it. You'd need to rebuild the upper section, not patch it. The repair has to restore the full cross-section, or the draw will be inconsistent even after the crack is sealed." Silas was quiet. He looked at the oven, then at the wall beyond it, then at a point between the two. "I should have looked at the roof in September," he said. It was not an apology in any formal sense. It contained no enumeration of consequence. It was a statement of technical fact delivered by a man who had arrived at a conclusion through his own process and was reporting the finding. Wren understood it for exactly what it was, which was sufficient. "Yes," she said, "nothing more." Florence had unwrapped her bundle near the flat stone, a round of cornbread slightly overbrowned on the bottom from an oven running too hot. She set it down with a carefulness that acknowledged it was not much in the context of what surrounded it, but was given with full sincerity, which made it considerable. Blythe came out of the garden passage with the remainder of the morning's kale harvest. She stopped when she saw the group assess the situation, then moved to the flat stone and set the kale beside Florence's cornbread, without comment, the practical movement of someone adding to a shared table. Caleb Pruitt lowered himself onto a stone near the fire, his bound leg extended. Florence had cut the cornbread. He held his peace. He looked at Blythe with an expression that had nothing easy in it, not guilt exactly, but the confrontation with a specific fact that abstract remorse had until this moment allowed him to avoid. The fact of a 9-year-old in a limestone canyon in January who had survived something he had watched begin without raising his voice. Blythe met his eyes. She held the look for a moment that lasted longer than was comfortable and shorter than it could have, then looked down at the stone. She ate her piece of cornbread with the focused attention she brought to everything, completely as though it were the obvious, appropriate response to being given food, which it was. Caleb ate his piece. That was its own accounting, made without words, in the only currency the situation accepted. Tate spent an hour with Wren going over the oven construction in specific technical detail, asking questions that were precise and useful, taking notes in a small book he had thought to bring. He left with information he would apply to the community ovens rebuilding within the week. When the group began its descent back toward the pass, the light had moved far enough west to announce that afternoon was not going to last much longer. Silas was among the last to leave. He stood at the canyon mouth and looked back at the shelter, not at Wren, but at the structure itself. The arrangement of stone and worked timber, the oven, the hanging frame. What a woman with a spade and a length of wire had built from a limestone canyon in December. He put his hat on, turned toward the pass. The days that followed belonged to the slow work of a winter beginning to consider its own ending. Not there yet, not close, but the quality of the light through the garden chamber's ceiling crack had shifted in the way that precedes rather than accompanies change. The kale continued its harvest cycle. The beets reached the size she had been waiting for. Blythe pulled the first one on. A gray morning cleaned it at the cookpot, cut it into sections. It was firm dense, a color so deep it was nearly black in the chamber light. The sweetness of it, the specific concentrated sweetness of a root that had spent its growing time in cold soil converting starches under sustained low temperature, was unlike anything either of them had tasted since before Dunmore Flats. Blythe ate her section without ceremony. Wren ate hers and did not say what it tasted like because Blythe already knew. That evening, Wren sat near the oven with Garrett's field notebook open in her lap to a blank page at the back. She had been using these pages since day 40 to record observations, temperature differentials, planting dates, harvest yields, structural modifications with their rationale. Not a journal. No feelings, no narrative requiring an audience. A technical document in the tradition of the man who had started it, accurate observation, faithfully recorded. She turned to the April 1879 entry. Read it one more time. Worth knowing. She looked at those two words for a moment, then turned to the next blank page. She wrote the date. She wrote the current temperature differential between the chamber floor and the external canyon. She wrote the condition of each planting row, the oven's performance in the previous baking cycle, the state of the snare network, the remaining supply inventory. She wrote until she had recorded everything that was true about the place she was in and how it was working. She closed the notebook. Outside, the wind moved through Greyhorn Pass with the sound of something that had been doing this for a very long time and would continue doing it long after any of them were finished. Inside, the fire held at the level she kept it, not high, not low, the precise degree of commitment that maintains temperature without consuming supply faster than necessary. Cutter breathed near the oven. Blythe slept on the platform with the deep, uncomplicated sleep of someone who has worked hard enough to earn it. Old Garrison sat against the warm wall in its wrapping, generating its small, reliable bubbles in the dark. The bread was made. The ground held. The starter was alive.